Mr. Henry and the Black and Tan Dog, Chapter 2. The Black and Tan Dog sauntered through the open door as though this was already her home. She had complete confidence with her head held high and her tail up and gently wagging, her little pink tongue lolling out of the side of her mouth and a happy grin lighting up her face. As Mr. Henry closed the door, he felt a sense of being in a dreamlike state. It all seemed so surreal. He couldn't remember the last time he had invited another living being, let alone a mangy stray dog, into his house. He wasn't sure what to do with it. So, he decided not to do anything at all. He decided to go about the rest of his morning routine, and this dog could come along or not. After all, Mr. Henry had not asked for this unwanted intrusion. And so Mr. Henry walked into the kitchen to finish making the morning coffee and begin cooking his breakfast as he usually did. The Black and Tan Dog followed him into the kitchen. Mr. Henry shooed her out, and she sat patiently just at the threshold of the kitchen door, watching his every move with her head cocked slightly to the side, as though she were studying him with curiosity. He began with the morning coffee. He put the coffee grounds in the grinder and turned it on. The Black and Tan Dog ran away at the sound and hid in the living room. Mr. Henry decided he was relieved the dog was not there staring at him while he simply tried to make his morning coffee, though, truth be told, a tiny part of him that he couldn't quite admit to yet felt something different, something softer and more affectionate for the dog. He put the freshly ground coffee in the coffee maker, filled the water, and pressed the brew button. He heard the telltale sound of the water beginning to percolate through the coffee grounds. Continuing with his Sunday morning breakfast routine, Mr. Henry went to the refrigerator and pulled out precisely 2 slices of bacon, 2 eggs, and 2 slices of whole wheat bread. He set a pan on the stove to heat, melting a small pat of butter on the skillet. As it began to sizzle and pop, he laid the bacon in the left side of the pan as he usually did. He then very carefully cracked 2 eggs in the right side of the pan, as he usually did. Next, he turned to put the 2 slices of bread in the toaster, as he usually did, but as he turned, he saw the Black and Tan Dog was sitting right at his feet, looking at him expectantly. This was not usual. "What do you want?" asked Mr. Henry, a little less gruffly than he had the first time. The dog sniffed at the bacon and eggs in the frying pan. "Oh, I see. You want to steal my breakfast, do you? Well, that's not going to happen." As he frowned down at the dog, Mr. Henry's heart softened a bit. "Well, I've got to have something else here you can eat." Mr. Henry tossed the toast in the toaster and went to the cupboard to look for some food appropriate for a dog. He realized he didn't have much in the way of canned goods. Over the years, he had created such a routine with his weekly groceries and eating habits that he rarely diverged from his normal habits and therefore rarely had anything in the cupboards beyond what was delivered each week by the grocer. He found a giant tin of flavored popcorn, likely from at least 3 Christmases ago when he last saw his niece Deirdre. She was always sending little gifts as invitations for him to join their holiday festivities. And 3 years ago, she'd arrived unannounced to drop by some Christmas cheer. Mr. Henry remembered hearing her coming up the driveway in her bright blue Toyota Prius hatchback. He had done what he usually did in the rare occasion someone came by unannounced. He'd quickly drawn all the curtains, turned out all the lights to give the appearance that no one was home. Then he sat and waited quietly for Deirdre to give up and leave. She had knocked on the door a few times and called out his name, then given up and left the tin of popcorn with a Christmas card on his front stoop. He'd found them later, after she'd gone, and he'd shoved them both in the cupboard to be out of sight. He hadn't even read the card. He could remember a time when Deirdre was very little, when he still went to family gatherings. She had been his favorite niece, and he her favorite uncle. She loved outdoorsy things like hiking and rock hunting. Mr. Henry had always admired and encouraged her inquisitive nature and intrepid spirit, even when other adults might not. It was one of the many reasons Deirdre always kept a special place in her heart for him. When she was small, they'd enjoyed digging trenches together in the backyard and looking through her extensive collection of polished river stones. She was always in awe of his ability to tell her which was a quartz, which a fluorite, which a calcite, and so on. By the time she was 9, she could tell the diagnostic qualities of all of these minerals and more. For her 10th birthday, Mr. Henry had gotten her a tiny rock hammer. He remembered telling her, "You know, often the best way to identify a mineral is to break it. Each mineral has unique angles or planes along which it breaks, called cleavage planes." Deirdre had loved testing the diagnostic qualities of rocks, and upon receiving her rock hammer, proceeded to break several of her favorite rocks to confirm their identity. She then lamented how sad it was that to know the identity of a mineral meant you also had to destroy it. Mr. Henry thought that described very perfectly what he believed about human relationships. He had become convinced that to know someone truly was to destroy his image of them. The reality never matched the expectation. People were always going to disappoint you, prove to be something other than what you believed them to be, and so he had determined that people and relationships were a waste of time. Mr. Henry shook his head to clear it of these painful memories as he pushed the popcorn tin aside. The Christmas card Deirdre had left him 3 years before fell from atop the tin. Mr. Henry picked it up, deciding to replace it on top of the tin, but his hand and heart did not agree with his mind, and so, instead of replacing the card on top of the tin, Mr. Henry instead placed it in his trouser pocket. He brought his focus back to the task at hand and finally found in the back of the cupboard an old tin of sardines. He couldn't recall when or if he'd purchased them. He vaguely remembered they were perhaps included in a grocery order by mistake. He checked the expiration date, and they'd only expired 2 months ago. He figured they were probably still fine, since he believed expiration dates were actually a conspiracy of the food companies to encourage more consumer waste. He then dug through the dish cabinet and found an old cracked bowl he never used. He opened the sardines and dumped them into the bowl, oil and all. He set them down on the kitchen floor in front of the black and tan dog. The hungry dog gulped them down excitedly, licking the bowl long after the contents were gone, then looked around for more. Mr. Henry felt a strange tightness in his cheeks that felt abnormal, as though the muscles in his face were being used in ways they hadn't for a long time. Mr. Henry touched his face thoughtfully. It was only then that he realized that strange tightness he felt was because he was smiling. The very thought quickly turned his smile to a resolute scowl, which only intensified because just then Mr. Henry smelled something burning. His bacon and eggs had not been flipped as he usually did, and they were now scorched. Mr. Henry uttered a curse as he ran to take the pan off the heat. He let out an exasperated sigh and then looked at the dog, watching him expectantly. "Well, I suppose these are barely edible. I couldn't possibly eat them now. I suppose this was your plan all along?" he said accusingly, and then, looking back at the scorched breakfast in the pan, sighed as he picked up the still fishy-smelling cracked bowl from the kitchen floor and spooned the scorched eggs and bacon into it. "I suppose you could have this, and I could make myself another round of bacon and eggs. And this toast will be cold by the time the bacon and eggs are done, so I suppose you can have that too. Who likes cold toast, after all?" Mr. Henry said, as he tore up the toast and tossed it along with the bacon and eggs into the dog's bowl. At this moment, as Mr. Henry made thin rationalizations for why he was feeding this dog his breakfast, he was unaware of the fact that the black and tan dog was trying to work out what was happening. After all, he didn't speak dog and she didn't speak human, so there was much confusion in the communication between the two of them. To the black and tan dog, the man seemed both angry and kind, for he did seem to be feeding her, but his body language was giving her very mixed signals. Then she'd always found humans quite confusing. Like, for example, she would never understand garbage cans. They always seemed to be full of perfectly good food. What could possibly possess people to make them throw all that food away? Mind you, she didn't question this too much, as while she'd been living on the streets, those garbage cans were her dinner buffets. But here was this strange, confusing man cooking food for her, giving her her very own dog bowl. She'd never had a dog bowl before. She was overwhelmed with a sense of belonging she'd never felt. So, in that moment, the black and tan dog, unbeknownst to Mr. Henry, was making up her mind. She was going to convince Mr. Henry to keep her. She'd never had such rare delicacies as sardines, bacon, and eggs, at least not fresh out of the frying pan, and she liked it. In the next moment, the black and tan dog had her face shoved in a bowl of bacon and eggs. With all other thoughts and awareness gone and her sole focus on eating, she was likewise unaware that the generally sour Mr. Henry was smiling as he watched her eat, and this time he allowed himself a brief moment of contentment before turning his attention back to the much more sensible task of preparing his breakfast. As he prepared his second attempt at breakfast, the black and tan dog came to sit by his side, where she quickly fell asleep with her head nestled on his feet. Mr. Henry felt an odd sense of calm in her presence, so much so that when his breakfast was ready, he didn't want to wake her and end the moment. So Mr. Henry did something he never usually did. Instead of eating his breakfast at the table, he stayed where he was as not to disturb the content dog sleeping at his feet, and he ate his breakfast straight out of the pan. When he was finished, he stood there for a long while sipping his coffee, just watching the gentle rise and fall of the black and tan dog's chest as she slept, trying to make sense of the odd, aching feeling in his chest. As he leaned against the stove, watching the black and tan dog sleep, he heard a faint crinkle and was reminded of the Christmas card in his trouser pocket, the one Deirdre had left 3 years ago. He set down his coffee and pulled out the card. He set it on the kitchen counter next to the stove. He considered opening it, but he decided it was better to just imagine what it said. After all, he reminded himself, the reality never matches the expectation. So instead, he turned and exited the kitchen. The black and tan dog woke abruptly and looked around the room, but Mr. Henry was already gone.